Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in tonight. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, the Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Lee Vandervoo to discuss her new book, As the World Burns, The New Generation of Activists and the Landmark Legal Fight Against Climate Change, published by Timber Press. Do children have a right to inherit a livable planet? And if so, is the government obliged to protect it? That's the question posed by Juliana versus United States, one of the most critical lawsuits of our time. 21 young people from across America sued the federal government over climate change, but the trial hasn't happened yet. As the World Burns follows the plight of the young plaintiffs, chronicling their legal battle through a year of drought and wildfire, floods and hurricanes, and the most tumultuous political season in modern history. Lee Vandervoo is an award-winning investigative and environmental journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, among others. Her 2016 book, The Fish Market, which chronicles the gentrification of the sea in the name of sustainable seafood, won an Oregon Book Award for general nonfiction. In conversation with Lee this evening, we have Levi Treyheim. You have to find the way of nature is one of Levi's messages for the world from his beloved home of a barrier island in Florida, just 13 feet above sea level. His island has been impacted by environmental issues from red algae blooms to increasing storms from climate change. The youngest plaintiff, Levi, has been speaking at marches and rallies in his neighborhood to bring attention to the risks climate change poses to low-lying Florida. We'll have some time to take audience questions after the talk, so please go ahead and put in your questions anytime during the broadcast by using the Ask a Question function at the bottom of the screen. You can order your copy of As the World Burns from Books and Books below by pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. Every purchase you make keeps Books and Books up and running, so we thank you. You can also press the donate button anytime, and any amount is welcome. Indie bookstores need your help now more than ever. And now, without further ado, I'd like to bring our guests to the stage. Hi, Lee.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here.
Of course.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about the book first?
Sure.
As I look for Levi in the green room. I'll be back.
So a little bit of backstory, I guess, in how this book came to be. I'm a journalist. I live in Oregon, and I started following this case in 2018. And prior to that, I think a lot of people in the legal community and maybe even in the environmental community dismissed it as a bit of a long shot. Having 21 kids sue the federal government on constitutional grounds is a very unusual case as environmental cases go. And the thinking was that it'll not go anywhere, or maybe this is just a media ploy. But it defied expectations for years. And in 2018, this case was making it to trial. In the spring, the trial date was set. It actually was the second trial date set, so it seemed very clear this was a real thing. It was going to happen. And from that point, it was clear to me from the media perspective, or at least my media perspective, that this is actually one of the most important trials in America. Now I think of it as one of the most important trials in America that hasn't happened yet. The trial was canceled actually in the fall of 2018, following some fairly heavy-handed legal tactics on the government's part. So the plaintiffs are now appealing just to get back into court. And at the time that I was preparing to cover this trial, my thinking was that I was going to be there every day and I was going to be making news dispatches from the courtroom. I did not imagine that this would become a book. The objective was to meet the plaintiffs, get to know them, understand the climate impacts in the regions, and be prepared to go into court and do the daily reporting. That was kind of my bread and butter at the time. So in the lead up to trial, I developed these relationships with these plaintiffs and with these families, and learned a great deal about climate impacts to their regions. And when the trial was canceled, I found myself, like the plaintiffs, kind of in this waiting mode for when are we going to get back to what was planned. And it was a lot of touch and go for many months before it was clear the trial wouldn't resume right away. What ended up happening was that I followed the group for about a year as they waited for trial, and it turned out to be an incredibly important year. The following November, so just, trial was canceled. It was set for October 29th. November, just some days, weeks later, 3 really important things happened. The first was that the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, by consensus, told the world that we have 12 years to take definitive action on climate change to avert a climate breakdown. That same month, we also had a record horrible fire season in California, and the whole town of Paradise, California was lost. We also, in that election season, had an incredible congressional fight for power with a president who didn't believe that climate change was actually happening. And these things galvanized youth in America to join the international climate movement that was growing. So I followed the plaintiffs into this broader activism community toward climate remediation. That's how this book came about. I wrote it because it happened and because I thought that this is an incredibly, incredibly important story, and it's an important story to tell right now. So, with that, love to chat and take some questions. Is Levi with us?
Not yet. I think he's just running behind a little bit, so we'll keep watching out for him as we continue the conversation.
Okay.
I want to ask you, so who is the oldest plaintiff of the 21?
The oldest plaintiff is Kelsey Juliana. She is the case's namesake. She's an Oregonian, and she was 19 years old when it was filed. By contrast, Levi, the youngest, was 8.
Wow.
So that was 5 years ago. They're a little bit older now. But Kelsey is a longtime climate activist, and she took up the charge quite young. She marched across the country in support of climate remediation at a very young age. I think she was younger than Levi is now. So very active, very, very committed advocate.
How did they decide to do it? How did they meet? Did they know each other beforehand? How were they brought together to do
Some
this?
of the plaintiffs did know each other. So the legal nonprofit that represents the plaintiffs in this case undertook many dozens of other lawsuits before this one. So it's called Our Children's Trust. It's based in Oregon, and it represents children on climate issues. So the attorneys and founding attorney, Julia Olson of Our Children's Trust, had in her mind a vision for having not only federal litigation, but 50 states of litigation representing kids on climate issues across the nation. And so a lot of those dropped a couple years before this case. And Kelsey was a state level plaintiff. So to her primary co-defendant, who's Shutezcott Martinez, a really, really active climate advocate, and the youth director of Earth Guardians, the environmental organization. So those two were representing Oregon in litigation and also Colorado. When it came time to have another federal case, they had relationships with a lot of these other plaintiffs and pulled them into the mix. Others had heard about, the climate litigation before that point and decided that they would like to be a part of any federal lawsuits and had reached out to Our Children's Trust themselves. A few others, and Levi, I think, is one of these, were recruited by organizations in their community. So Levi was recruited by his church.
So what's the next step?
The next step, so the case is in an appellate phase. Following the moment that I just described, there was a year of hearings earlier this year. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed the case, and the plaintiffs are now asking to be heard by a full court. The full court. They were initially heard by a panel of 3 judges. They're asking the whole Ninth Circuit to rehear their case and send them back to the district court for trial.
Okay. I hear an echo. I'm not sure if you have another tab open on your computer. You might want to just close it.
Okay.
If you do.
I do.
Okay, because I didn't hear it before, but there you go. Better.
Better?
Well, we'll roll with it.
Okay.
So, virtual events. What was it like to meet these plaintiffs, their families, I'm sure? What was it like to interview them and work with them? What did you learn from the process?
Well, it's honestly really intimidating to interview kids. I think interviewing adults is, there's a bit of a script. People understand how that works. Kids are just like, all bets are off. They'll take the gloves off. Like it's tough in that way. It's a very real experience. There's nothing scripted about interviewing children. And so that was, it was tough at times. In that way that not necessarily with the plaintiffs, but I also, I cover the youth climate movement for The Guardian and other publications. And I've definitely had some really tough interviews with kids where, they're very worked up about the issue and I'm the only adult in the room. So, you have to work through that, especially on environment, I think. But, what I learned more than anything is that these young people know a lot more about this issue than I do. And that climate change is one of these issues that I think sort of flips the wisdom paradigm that we're used to. We're used to, in our culture, in many cultures, deferring to our elders to give us, the knowledge, right? The wisdom of time. And climate change is something that we've only come to understand more recently. Those of us who are my age, I'm a Gen Xer and older, we don't necessarily have the foundational knowledge that the young people have that makes them feel so urgently about these issues. But they are learning this in school, middle school age, in 37 states, kids are getting education about climate change. So I think in this case, they often are much more knowledgeable than the adults. And also, unfortunately are dealing with the problem of not being taken maybe as seriously because of their age. So my experience working with these plaintiffs really radically changed my view about climate change, and it was one of the things that drove me to write the book. So I hope people take that away from it as well, honestly.
Do you know if Greta knows about this?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Or has she been in touch? Has there been any contact of that kind?
Yeah, absolutely. Greta has observed, of course, other youth activists around the world before becoming her own activist, and these kids are very, very visible as being leading youth activists in America. So she's familiar with many of them. I know that she followed Chutezcott and his work for Earth Guardians. And she did come here to the U.S. During her tour in 2019. She did some events together in Washington, D.C. with these plaintiffs, including Levi. So they are aware of one another's efforts and do support each other.
So can you tell us a little bit about Levi, since in his absence, maybe tell us. He just does not seem to have shown up just yet. I don't know what's going on, but we may or may not have him with us tonight. So maybe you can, tell us a little bit about him.
Sure. I hate to speak for him, so I'll just do my best to speak a little bit about him. Hopefully he's okay. I actually spoke to him yesterday and he was looking forward to this. And so Not quite sure. Maybe he's just having some technical challenges. But Levi is the youngest plaintiff in the Juliana case. As I said, he was 8 years old when it was filed. He is really energetic, exuberant climate advocate, and a very important part of this case. His claims in the litigation have to do with his life on Barrier Island off the east coast of Florida. So he can speak very eloquently about that if he's able to join us, but his primary concern is for sea level rise and for the worsening hurricanes that have caused him to be evacuated several times already. And I know that that's the biggest concern for him and for his family.
Okay. Sorry, I'm still trying to look out for him and see if he shows up. So when do you think that, have you seen David Attenborough's video or documentary about climate change?
Oh, I've seen many. I'm not sure which one it is.
So I guess the one that's out there now doing the rounds, where actually Billie Eilish actually sings it or is part of it. Anyway,
I haven't seen that.
His work in general, I think it's very interesting because he truly regards and incorporates young people in this battle that we have. How do you see things with the current administration, and just think as things are changing now as we head into the election? Is there any new knowledge about what might come? Do you want to comment about that?
Well, of this particular case or climate change generally, or both?
I think both. Yeah.
Okay. You know what? I mean, the young people are the affected generation. They have every right to be the forefront and and to my mind, the moral voice on this issue, right? I mean, you know, people who are not going to be around to have to care about how these issues with the environment turn out are too often, from my perspective, shouting down the young people who feel very passionately about this. And I think I've had enough conversations with young people to know that this is not just like some kind of passing environmental fad or something. This is very deep and personal for many of them. And I've had conversations with kids about whether or not they still love their grandparents because their grandparents don't believe in something that they think could kill them, could prevent them from having healthy children. You know, these are things that kids really take on, and for appropriate reason, right? We are out of time, and whoever is the next president will either take meaningful action on this or they won't. But if we count down another 4 years from, you know, let's see, we're down to 10 now, we're getting to a situation where the solutions for preventing a severe climate impacts to our nation and to the young people of the nation are going to become farther from reach, right? We just had, of course, and they're still having a pandemic. This is why we're doing all this virtually. And we spent $2 trillion in a rescue mission for those of us who are living, you know, paycheck to paycheck right now. And that's the same price tag that scientists and experts have told us is the cost of transitioning to a safer energy system that could completely get us out of this mess. We have heard for many years that kind of a price tag is unaffordable, that it'll break the nation, that it'll send us back to the dark ages, and we'll all be churning our butter, you know, out in the yard. Realistically, we now see through COVID that this is a sum that American can borrow quite easily without raising taxes on the rank and file. And, you know, you see the cost of energy just completely diving in a world where nobody needs it because nobody's going anywhere. and suddenly the cost of having renewable energy is overnight cheaper. We could do this right now, and we could spare young people the horrible headache of having to do it later. Doing it later, putting aside all just the emotional pain of losing homes to wildfire and floods and other natural disasters that are increasingly frequent, there is tremendous economic pain with that. At the point that sea levels rise, you're building dikes, right? You're not just transitioning energy. So, I think this is an incredibly important issue that we need a meaningful response to very soon.
Yes, it is incredibly urgent. And I do feel that President Biden would pay attention and would address things very differently. So I can only hope. I feel sorrow about the state of our world, every single day. And but I also feel the hope of this generation. I feel the hope of the younger generation to kind of be the leaders and tell us, how to do this stuff and why we need to do it. And so I will continue holding out hope in that way. So I wonder if you would care, I know maybe you weren't prepared to, but if you would care to give, maybe do a few little readings of the book for us tonight, maybe just give us a taste of what it is.
Sure.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's just great. I'm happy to do that. And I just want to echo your statements that I do think working with young people on this is an incredibly positive experience, and I don't find myself despairing about this issue. And it's not because I feel like, oh, the kids will come and save us. I know as adults we have to do our part, but it just makes you realize that there's a whole generation of voices out there that's very positive and sees solutions that we don't hear from because we've kind of written it off in some ways as older people in a very gloom and doom kind of way. I think once you start bringing young people in, you really hear the solutions.
Agreed, especially if you listen.
Yeah, so you ask about the federal government. I'll read a section that this is from the last hearing on this case, and this should give you a bit of perspective of where the current government stands on this issue. Then it is June 4th. The Juliana attorneys walk into a federal courtroom in downtown Portland with a rolling cart stuffed with case files. Our Children's Trust is throwing so much legal firepower at today's Ninth Circuit hearing that it's a task just to get all of the attorneys into chairs. A panel of 3 judges is set to hear arguments about whether the Juliana trial should go forward. With only 100 seats in the courtroom, a wood-paneled place with the typical wooden benches, plaintiffs, their parents, and the press are seated first. Then the court staff begins the tall task of filling the remaining seats in the nearby overflow room. The people who have lined up to attend this hearing, most of them are still school age. Many have no affiliation with the case, no affiliation with the plaintiffs. Their only affiliation is the issue. They are here because Juliana versus the United States is about them. In fact, there is so much demand to see this hearing, and enough of an effort on the part of Our Children's Trust to make it visible, that the court has agreed to live stream the proceedings into nearby Director Park, an open plaza between a triad of towering buildings and a historic movie theater. In the park, it is bedlam. The stone ground is covered with supporters and activists rallying around signs to let the youth be heard. They assemble under the watchful eye of 12 giant puppets of the last 12 presidents, the ones to have presided over the nation's lackluster response to climate change, as organizers rally the crowd in anticipation. The plaintiffs, most of them are, of course, here, wearing the combined expressions of excitement and composure that are typical in court. They are catching up, many not having seen one another in the months since the trial was canceled. Miko and Jaden are in intermittent confab, Jaden having left Louisiana for New Mexico and leaving behind the oil politics for good. Jacob took a day off the farm and off school, having been admitted to a prestigious online program that MIT has begun to combat problems like poverty and hunger, geared toward non-traditional learners like young farmers. The Eugene high schoolers are seated together, having made it through their freshman year. And Kelsey, also back to school at the University of Oregon, is center stage, turning in her seat to face Vic and the plaintiffs behind her to check in. Everyone is in their finery, Isaac especially crisp in a black button-down, gray suit jacket. Nick, who has just finished high school and is about to begin studying theoretical math, confesses that he failed to pack appropriate socks, then comically flashes his ankles. In these moments before the hearings begin, long before the plaintiffs emerge from the courthouse to the flash of cameras in a parade that will march them to the park, Levi riding on Nathan's shoulders and Kelsey screaming, the news that today's hearing has just become a Snapchat filter. The courtroom is quiet and the tension thick. The Department of Justice has assembled its team of 4 attorneys, and Jeffrey Bossert Clark, clad in a gray suit, is poised to argue the government's case. The room goes quiet, and in these last few moments, a courthouse staffer begins reciting Jabberwocky for a final sound check of the microphones. So rested he by the tum-tum tree and stood a while and thought. There is a soft collective giggle from the youngest people in the room. When it begins, Clark argues that the Juliana case is an attack on the separation of powers because it circumvents a lot of things, a bunch of statutes, public comment periods, the Constitution, arguably, by not letting Congress solve the problem of climate change. If the case were allowed to go forward, he says, it would mean that any situation in which someone made a claim that their health and safety was in peril could be made into a constitutional case, skirting the usual administrative appeals and other required processes, the ones that Mary Christina Wood said were not working in the first place. Judge Andrew Hurwitz frowns with his forehead, leans across the bench toward where Clark stands, and gives Clark a hypothetical. Say rogue raiders are coming across the Canadian border into the Northwest, kidnapping children of a certain age and murdering them. Say the White House refuses to do anything. Say Congress doesn't act. Can those people go to the court to make it stop? No, Clark says. It just isn't what the judicial branch is there for, to deal with these kinds of exigent threats. That's why we have a president. Why the president can take the nation to war. The remedy in the murderers-kidnapper scenario, Clark says, if the president and local governors aren't doing anything about it, would be the vote to vote the president and the governors out of office. It's not for the judiciary to take over, he says. However painful, to preserve the constitutional design of America, a few unlucky kids would have to die by the hand of rogue Canadian kidnappers. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So what can we do to support the plaintiffs, to support this issue? What can people like us, our viewers, what is a step that we could take on a daily basis to help?
Well, I think, the important thing is keeping it front of mind and doing what you can. And I think, that looks different for every person. Sometimes when we try to be prescriptive about these sorts of things, it becomes overwhelming. And the most important thing for people to understand is that if all of us were our best environmental selves all the time, and we always recycled and we never got the plastic packaging, and we rode our bikes instead of driving our cars, or we got EVs and solar panels, all of us would only ever impact climate emissions by 1 to 2%. So greenhouse gases are very little impacted by individual action. That's not to say that it doesn't matter. The intention is really important. But what we need wholesale systemic change. The United States is responsible and concedes this in this lawsuit, by the way, though probably tonight's debate will convince you otherwise, right, that our government doesn't believe in climate change. In fact, The United States government has ceded in this case that climate change is real, it's an imminent threat, and that this country is responsible for 25% of global greenhouse gas accumulations throughout history. So what we need to fix that is wholesale systemic change, and primarily we need to get off of a fossil fuel energy system. Voting is one thing that pushes us in that direction, but just understanding that knowledge and sharing it is also a really important thing. When I asked this question to Shutescott, and I do explore this a bit in the book, he says this is one of these fights that needs everything. Sometimes you need architects, sometimes you need musicians just to make songs that help people understand what the problem is, which is his skill as he is a hip hop artist. Everybody brings something different. If you just approach the problem with the primary knowledge that it's bigger than what we can do at the cash register or when we're recycling in the evenings, that's a great first step. And then beyond that, whatever you can bring.
So I'm curious about whether any of the plaintiffs come from Christian families. I see sometimes the resistance to accept climate change that comes from some faith-based households and I wonder about that and how that can be addressed.
Yeah, that's a really tough issue. There is not a Christian plaintiff. There are, however, several religious plaintiffs. And I was really interested actually in the role that religious institutions did play in this case and the lives of these plaintiffs. Levi, as I mentioned, is a Unitarian Universalist church congregate. So he was introduced to the case through his pastor and has had tremendous support from that church and has gone on to speak. He did a tour of Northwest churches speaking, and he probably has done many in the Southeast as well, although I don't know for sure. There is a plaintiff who is a Catholic. There is a plaintiff who's a Quaker. Both, I think, are fairly practicing. Two of the plaintiffs are Jewish and do practice. There is also a plaintiff who was a member of the UCC Church, so the United Church of Christ, and their mother was a minister in the Eugene Church. And that plaintiff has gone so far as to represent the UCC in a sort of international church gathering in a convention in Geneva a couple of years ago. So creating that kind of platform for young people to speak about the environment is really an incredible thing. And I do see a lot of the plaintiffs' congregations and community leaders, religious leaders doing that.
Good. Because I often we observe the conflict between faith and science, whereas really it should be the other way around, like what the human mind is capable of doing comes from God, Anyway, I'm not an expert on any of this. I just find it kind of really interesting, actually.
Me too. I mean, I will say one of the plaintiffs, Nick Venner, who's from Colorado, one of his primary, inspirations was he was listening to a speech that was given by a Catholic. It was an encyclical on the environment, and I can't remember the title of it, but I remember his mom telling me the story that he was still young enough to be in a booster seat in the back seat of the car, and she was driving, listening to it, and he heard it, and he said, "Oh my, this makes sense." And this plaintiff years later was like so excited for Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, that he translated it from Italian before the English was available because he couldn't wait to hear what it said. Wow. So, there is a role for religion for sure. And I don't necessarily think that religion and science faith and science need to be at odds with one another.
Agreed, agreed. So let's turn to maybe a little bit of, are there things that you have read, books that you have read that you find have given you some insight into climate change? What have you been doing during the pandemic, you yourself, just to get through it as a writer, as a journalist? Have you kept busy? What has life been like?
I've kept very busy, honestly. Just talking about the book and doing these kinds of events. I also have some material from the cutting room floor for writing the book that I felt like really needed more attention. So I've been doing articles out of those. I just had one in ProPublica the week before last, I think, that was about an energy project in the Northwest. It's a LNG export facility that was proposed and approved right after the shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty interesting project. I
I see a loom in the background there.
yeah, I weave, and I actually this is for me almost a way of writing. The thing that influenced me the most, honestly, is not so much anything I read or watched movie wise, although I did consume an awful lot of that stuff in writing. But the thing I probably consumed the most was my interviews with the plaintiffs. I recorded those and I listened to them over and over, and I often weave while I do that. And I just kind of, wait for certain ideas to kind of bubble up. And when I feel like a passage is coming out of that, then I walk over to the computer and I write it. But mostly I just like sit with the material.
Great, great. Are you someone who enjoys nature a lot?
Oh yeah. Yeah. This is a requirement
Dumb
for
question, of course.
writing. Yes. Absolutely. And I have found a lot of silver lining in the pandemic, and that, it's so quiet sometimes. I necessarily live in a city, live near an airport, for this work, I think is kind of essential, even though I try to travel as little as possible. But, to have weeks where there was no overhead noise, there was no traffic, to really just get to know the birds that were living in my backyard, and really have more of a quiet experience with the natural world around me was really neat. And it sort of sticks. Like, I now just had this great conversation with my neighbor last weekend about all the goldfinches and red finches that we've been seeing, and how we used to have 2 turtle doves and now we have 4. And I think there's a lot still happening that's really positive.
I can totally relate to those conversations. I've been having some of those myself. It's incredible what you can see when you actually take the time to look. So I want to remind people watching that now is the time. If you have some questions that you'd like to share with Lee, you can just use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and we can get to those. But I think we have like a shy audience. So please, if you're out there, ask us a few questions. I'm sorry that Levi couldn't join us. I really wanted to meet him. He seems exceptional, but such is life.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing him, and I hope that he's doing okay.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So as we wait, because no one is asking anything yet, can you tell me what it is that you'd like people to take from this book?
I really, I spoke with a class of students last week, and I asked them, what do you guys think about someone my age instead of someone your age writing this book? And they were college students, and most of them were in their early 20s. And one of them said, someone your age has to write this book because people my age already get it. If I wrote that for me and my friends, it'd be like not telling them anything new. So, that kind of hits home. I feel like that's what I want for people to take away from it most, is to understand the real intergenerational disconnect around these issues, and to really take to heart, how these plaintiffs, I think, represent so much of the youth view. I mean, they can't speak for all youth, but I do think that a lot of youth are really with them, and that's evident every time they have a court hearing and stand up, and it lights up the internet. And people rallied, for their mistrial hearing in like 70 nations around the world, like that. Not nations, sorry, 70 rallies, but they were in multiple countries, and that really says something about where young people are at with this. So I hope that takeaway is there.
What an interesting observation. Yes. So what I was going to, okay, so Timber Press, can you tell me a little bit about them? What they publish and how you connected to them, and maybe tell us a little bit about who you worked with as an editor and just the process of publishing the book?
Sure. Timber Press is based here in Portland, Oregon, and they're an imprint of Workman. They primarily published like gardening books and outdoor guides and things previously, and I think in the last couple of years, 3 years or so, have looked to transition to environmental nonfiction because they recognize that a lot of the content that they've been producing in books has been transitioning to free content online or more digital type content. And so my book is among one of their, I think, early investments in that transition. And it's been really great to work with them and be part of that. Workman also launched an audio department about the same time. So I did the audiobook for As the World Burns as well, which was really cool. People don't often realize, but as an author, you don't necessarily get to do that. Like, you have to audition for such things. And because my book is reported narrative and I am present in it, I think it was easy for me to slide into that role. And that was also really great. I worked, my editor is Stacy Lawrence here, and she's phenomenal. She saw the vision for the book very early on and what I was trying to do with it, which is awesome. I think I signed with them in, I want to say, April of 2019. So we've been working together about a year and a half now, and it's been good.
Have you been doing a lot of virtual events?
Yes.
For the book?
Yes. Yeah. I have a few different backgrounds, so you're the first to see my loom. Usually,
I love the loom so much. It's so beautiful. Okay, it looks like we might have a question.
Hit me.
Okay, here we go. So this is from Isaac Fitzsimmons. Based on your conversations with the plaintiffs, what do you think makes this younger generation different than previous ones regarding their views on climate change?
Thanks, Isaac. I think it's just the education. And I think also that simply, they're young enough to have to worry about how it turns out. It's really hard to have that conversation, I think, with older folks. I think I read the other day that the average age for people in leadership in Congress right now is 65. So if you can imagine, that we're talking about things that are happening on a 20 and 30 year timeline, such as, the outlook for sea level rise in Levi's community, impacting someone's decision making at that age is really difficult. Whereas I think, Levi and people his age, being 13 years old and thinking about in 20 years where you're going to be, that's the prime of your life. That's the point where you might be having children of your own. You're going to have a lot of important decisions to make and becoming the person that you'll be in society, and really, becoming the part of the nation that you want to see, right? The America that you want to see, and they want that place to be ready for them when they get there. They're very serious about a transition to a more holistic, natural environment for all of us. I just think there's a lot of really radically different thinking in the generations that came before, and mine as well. Something to point out is that we had this conversation in the past, right? The first Earth Day was in 1970, and we had, as a result of that, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We tried a lot of environmental tools that have, they've been eroded over time. And meanwhile, we were having a conversation about how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That, for somebody my age, was derailed into a conversation about nuclear. Nixon was looking at a renewable energy economy. Carter was looking at a renewable energy economy. And we started to talk about nuclear, and we got into the Cold War, and that became, the threat against the nation and the thing we need to be concerned about most. So as a Gen Xer, I grew up with this idea that that was the major threat against the nation. Climate change came after it. And when it did, it was more of like a consumer movement. It was not clear how urgent it was. It wasn't clear what kind of timeline we were on. And there was this emphasis on individual action. Well, if you just do the right things at the cash register, this problem is solved. I thought that, and I'm embarrassed to say that I thought that because I'm an environmental reporter and I should know better. But really, we didn't come back around to the urgency of the science until very recently. That 2018 November report really hit a lot of people over the head, and I think caught a lot of older people off guard. And there is more of an understanding socially that climate change is urgent now. If you look at polls and what people think about it, it's very, very clear. But it's not necessarily urgent for us. For young people, it's so urgent for them.
So here's a question, another one from Diana Douglas. Are other countries taking global warming seriously? And if so, what steps forward have they taken?
Yes, other countries are taking this more seriously. Quite a number signed the Kyoto Protocol, signed the Paris Agreement. It's kind of the heavy-hitting consuming nations that are falling behind, the United States being one of them. In fact, I think the United States is one of the only abstainer from Paris, along with Russia and Syria, I want to say. So we're kind of behind in this. Even, heavy consuming nations in the European Union have signed on. In the legal arena, there are a lot of these cases that have been filed by young people against their governments. In the Netherlands, a case like this actually was successful. The plaintiffs won a climate remediation plan, and it is currently being implemented. But what's hard about the US is when you go at it through the courts, we don't have the kind of human rights law baked into our Constitution that other nations have. So we're going to lag behind in that arena. And when you consider that the most affected generation is only barely old enough to vote, and many are not able to vote, influencing the executive branch, influencing Congress is much, much harder. That'll change with years, but maybe time we don't have.
Great. Well, thank you for that insight. I think sometimes we forget just how fully formed children actually are, and what, the kinds of advanced beings that they can be. We think, oh, they're kids, but actually, during the pandemic, something has been happening to me where I just, probably from the isolation or whatever, thinking about so many memories coming back from childhood and fully formed, and knowing how deeply I felt at that age. A lot of the things that we carry with us through adulthood are already there when we are children. They're already present. So I find that kind of, interesting, that I think we need to value young people a lot more and give them a place in our society, and not always try to just protect them or hold them back, or rein them in, but actually take their example and start learning from them. And I can only hope that as some of these paradigms are toppling, or like these paradigms are changing, maybe that will be part of a new society at some point. Anyway, I am rambling, but those are some thoughts. I feel so deeply about it, and I value young people so very much. And maybe it's the combination of young and old that can be perfect.
Yeah, I appreciate those thoughts, and I think intergenerational communication is really important. I mean, young people have sovereignty, they're people, they have values, and you know, something that I find kind of interesting is that they can be maybe a little more black and white and moralistic because they don't have the same experience that we have as older folks. But in a certain way, I mean, they have a lot of the values that we really try to teach them young. Be nice to everybody, make room for everybody else, share, and do the right thing. Sometimes, when they break this issue down and those by those very simple metrics, the answers are really much clearer. I think we've made it hard as grown-ups by talking about, oh, well, this economic, but not to belittle the economic questions. I actually think they bear out on the side of acting sooner. But we have really complicated matters quite a bit by naysaying and making things more difficult, when really it's like, I don't know. I mean, as a nation, we put a man on the moon, we invented the internet and the telegraph, and, are we really that afraid of just transitioning an energy system? Is it really that hard? And if we were listening to these clearer ideas about making sure there's enough for everybody and sharing and trying to do the right thing and being kind, would we really be this stuck?
Yeah, well, you put that beautifully. And I think that, yes, a lot of it is about going to the essence of things, being quiet and being able to actually get to the essence, and then taking action on those essential things. But anyway, so we have come to the end of our program. I want to remind everyone who's watching that you can order a copy of the book by pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm sorry Levi didn't make it, but it was really fascinating getting to talk to you and learning more about this book and about the process that led to it. So I thank you for joining us, and I hope that maybe soon we'll do it in person in Florida with Levi.
Sounds great.
And I thank you very much. If there's anything you want to end with, by all means, let us hear.
I thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'll show you a copy of the book so you can find it if you need. This is As the World Burns, and thanks for everybody for coming, and really appreciate you listening.
So thank you to everyone, and good night. Be well, and until the next time.